do herbivorous insects compete? These are some of the most speciose groups of animals on the planet. They, at least at face value, share a common resource, or could at least, plants. Is it possible that herbivorous insects actually compete? Well, interestingly, historically, most people have said no. This has to do with how people have studied competition in herbivorous insects and have looked primarily at two different dimensions of competition. One that is often referred to as exploitative competition, and the other one, which is interference competition. And we'll go into a little bit more details of those in a second. If you look at how much impact insects have on the biomass of plants, estimates vary depending on what biome you're in, depending on whether you're looking at crops or whether you're looking at plants occurring in nature. But generally, the estimates are that between 5 and 15% of biomass of plants is consumed by herbivorous insects. And if you just look at this, you would say, well, there's a lot of biomass left. Therefore, competition really should not be competition for resources, that is, groups, two species, trying to exploit the same pool of resources, green plant biomass, should not be limited. There's a lot of green stuff out there. And so this is really evidence that is inconsistent with the idea that competition might be important. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, there was a lot of observational data that seemed to show that organisms don't really overlap that much in their niches, and even when they occupy the same exact space, it doesn't look like they have a lot of impact on their populations. There was a very important study by Don Strong in the early 80s that examined the occurrence of hispine beetles, little chrysomelid beetles that occur within these whorls of heliconia species, birds of paradise plants in the tropics. And he documented that some of these beetles could have very high densities and even multiple species occurring within a very small space. And he and others basically described this as the fact that there's harmonious coexistence among organisms, and therefore that the evidence of competition is probably not really there. A very influential review by Ian Kaplan and Bob Deno in the early 2000s seemed to put this particular perspective on its head. What's shown here is a meta-analysis, or the summary of a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is basically when people look at existing literature, existing studies that have actually been done, and calculate the magnitude of an effect. In this case, the effect of herbivore species 1 on herbivore species 2. And then compare that across all of the studies. And there's various ways in which these data can actually be synthesized. You can look at things like the development time of herbivore 1 in the presence of herbivore 2. You can look at the body size. You can look at the oviposition preference, abundance, and so on. And if there is no effect of having two species co-occurring, feeding on the same resource, then you would expect the development time of one species in the presence of that species to be no different than in the absence of that species, so that the effects would be right here on the zero line. But in fact, what you find is that in over 73% of the cases that were examined across all of these different dimensions, survivorship, fecundity, and so on, a lot of these studies showed that in the presence, when species were co-occurring, one of these species seemed to perform worse than they were not when they were not co-occurring. So these points are below the line. So what's going on here? How is this consistent with this idea that there's a lot of plant material out there? You can look at this data in a lot more detail and ask a more detailed question, which is, under what conditions, what might we expect competition to actually be most intense? We would expect there to be more competition when there's more organisms around. If it's just a single individual of one, a single individual of another species, well, maybe there just isn't that much consumption of material to actually reduce the resource pool and therefore have competition available. So the bigger your densities are, the increased likelihood that there's going to be a negative effect of one species on another. You would also expect this effect to be most intense when there's actual co-occurrence. They actually exist in the same place and at the same time. It could be that two species feed on the same plant, but at completely different points in time. And there, you might expect there not to be an important role of competition. And you might also expect the more ecologically similar species are. Maybe they're the same genus, or maybe they feed in the same way on the plants. Leaf chewers, two leaf chewers feeding on the same plant would be a greater likelihood that you would actually observe this. And again, I want to stress that most of the data before the 1980s really was observational and not experimental. And so when Kaplan and Deno looked at the data, they were focusing on experimental data. So what do these patterns actually look like? What's interesting in this particular summary of the meta-analysis of the literature that's out there is if you look at how much leaf area was actually consumed and made to disappear by one species, and then you looked at the effect on a second species, on reproduction, on survivorship, on size, body size, and a bunch of other things, you actually see that there's generally not a lot of effect of changing the intensity of defoliation on these on the second species. So, that's strange. So if the resource pool is shrinking, you would have expected this to be negative, that the more leaf material is gone, the more intense the effect would be observed by the second species. So that doesn't seem to be the case. Well, what about differences between feeding guilds? Again, you might expect that species that feed in the same way on a plant might experience a greater amount of competition. And maybe species that are more closely related, things that might be in the same genus, might experience more competition than species that are very far apart from each other. Well, what's interesting here is that, again, there is an effect of one species on another one. This effect size is negative, but it doesn't seem that species in the same genus actually experience any more intense competition than those that are more distantly related. Leaf chewers seem to maybe show a more significant effect. On the other hand, sap feeders, things like aphids and so on, seem to actually have very little effect. This effect is actually stronger when you're looking at within the same genus, but actually is very weak when you're looking at things within the same family. Aphids in general don't necessarily compete, but maybe aphids in the genus Aphis might be more likely to compete. So this is a bit inconsistent. And what about comparing the effect of intraspecific competition to the effect of interspecific competition? You could think of this as the most intense way in which two organisms might interact. You're going to feed in the same way, in the same place, with the same requirements with members of your own species, whereas a different species might show slightly different characteristics and therefore show a little bit less level of intensity of interaction. So the prediction generally for competition is that intraspecific competition within the same species should be greater than competition across species. And when you look again at the summary of these meta-analyses, it doesn't look like there's a lot of difference between species interacting across species versus individuals interacting within a species. The magnitude of the effect is about the same. Another big question mark. Okay, what about the spatio and temporal separation between these organisms? If there's no temporal or spatial separation, again, you might expect the intensity of competition to be the greatest. That's this gray bar here. And again, we could look at growth rate, survivorship, abundance, and a bunch of other things. And the main thing I want you to take away from this is that there's no really strong patterns across most of these different groups. That species that are separated in space and time actually have about the same intensity of effect on each other as when they're actually co-occurring at the same place and at the same time. Maybe there's a few exceptions like this one here on fecundity. This is the amount of eggs that a female might produce. Maybe this one here also on kind of the overall effect size, but it's not very consistent across species. Although, maybe on average, co-occurrence might actually be a little bit more, result in a little bit more intense. Okay, so do herbivorous insects compete? Well, the evidence clearly shows that they do, but they don't compete in the way that the predictions about that classical competition theory, resource-based exploitation of a shared common pool, would predict. There seems to be a strong asymmetry in the interactions. It seems to not vary as much across feeding guilds. Phylogenetic patterns, relatedness seems to be kind of weak. The intra and interspecific competition is not as evident as you might expect. And there's a lot of variability in co-occurrence in space and time on the effect on competition. So what's going on here? One way to kind of summarize the classical way of thinking about competition is to draw these kinds of interaction diagrams like this. Along, though, this categorical axis here, you show the first, the second, and the third trophic level. Herbivores are on the second trophic level because they feed on plants, P here. In the classical formation in interference of competition, there's two different modes. One is interference competition, where one species actually co-ops and physically interacts with the other species so that there is the second species is affected in some way. Most classically, this is things like usurping a nesting site. So if species 1 gets to the nesting site before species 2 has fewer of them to actually use, and therefore there's a negative direct interaction between species 1 and species 2. Sometimes this is also a physical encounter between two species. One of them will actually physically exclude or launch off or do something so as to increase the resource capture abilities compared to the other one. You could think of this like the big stag beetle example, where one species is actually kind of pushing the other one off of a log and having access to mating sites. Turns out that when you look at things like territorial defense, direct aggressions, fighting for resources, actual physical interactions, there are some studies that actually show the existence of this, but they're relatively small. Maybe only about 10%, 12% of the studies showed any evidence of interference competition. The more common type of competition that we often think about is competition for a shared resource pool. That is, herbivore 1 interacts with herbivore 2 indirectly, notice the dotted line here instead of the solid line, by utilizing the resource pool of the plants better, faster, more efficiently than herbivore 2, and therefore there's less of this to go around, and this is how you get a negative effect of species 1 on species 2. This is referred to as exploitative competition. This is an indirect effect mediated by the resource pool, where one species exploits the resource, the plant, better and faster than the other species, and therefore has the ability to grow, survive, reproduce better than the other species. So again, this is an indirect interaction involving the changes in the quality of the host plant. This is the indirect effect involving changes in the quantity of the host plant tissue. There's just less of it to go around. And yes, there are examples of this. Maybe about 20% of the examples that show competition actually occurring have this type of a mode. This is really the old paradigm. So when people would look at the data, they would say, well, this is the way that competition is actually supposed to happen between herbivorous insects. Well, what Kaplan and Deno really showed is that there's actually other ways in which herbivores have the ability to compete. One of them is that there's an indirect effect affecting, one of them is that herbivore 1 has an indirect effect on herbivore 2 through changes in the plant quality. That is to say, the feeding of herbivore 1 on the plant actually changes the plant constituents in some way. It might increase the nitrogen availability. Maybe the plant is mobilizing amino acids to try to defend itself, and that might have a positive effect on the second herbivore. On the other hand, herbivore 1 might stimulate a defensive response where plant secondary metabolites like secondary plant compounds, defensive compounds, are upregulated, and when a second species comes around, it now has to deal with these things that maybe it doesn't know how to deal with. So this is a plant-mediated effect, And this plant-mediated effect is actually very common in the literature. About 50% of the studies that they examined actually showed some kind of negative indirect effect, not through the amount of plant material changing, but the quality of the plant material actually changing. And actually, about 13% of the studies showed a benefit of being a second herbivore on that plant, feeding on that plant, through some kind of improvement of plant quality that is induced by species 1. So that herbivore-herbivore interaction generally tends to be negative, but it doesn't always have to be negative. And the final example that they looked at, whereby an herbivore might affect another herbivore feeding on the plant, actually has nothing to do with the plant itself, but it has to do with the fact that it interacts with natural enemies that are present in the system. And these natural enemies here may be shared by multiple herbivores, like this one here and this one here, so that the presence of this herbivore might negatively affect this herbivore here because natural enemies aggregate to a site and then maybe preferentially feed on the second herbivore, like this. So this is an example of a negative indirect effect. And this example here is actually referred to as apparent competition. It looks like these two are competing in the traditional way for a shared resource, when in fact they're competing through changes in a shared natural enemy, that third trophic level. And these are also observed in nature. A few of these examples where changes in one herbivore affects another herbivore are actually mediated by the natural enemies. Maybe about 5% of them show a negative effect, and maybe about half of that actually show a positive effect, where maybe having these two species around actually might confuse or otherwise distract or makes these natural enemies less efficient. So this is an example of facilitation. So really, we have a very different way of thinking about competition between herbivores. These indirect effects of herbivore 1, say this leaf beetle here, and herbivore 2, this caterpillar here, can manifest themselves in a whole variety of ways. Rarely, they can manifest through changes in plant quantity. The resource pool shrinks, there's just less food to go around. But more often than not, there's a change in the plant chemistry, and that is how this interaction is actually mediated. And of course, not to forget that these interactions are happening in the context of a food web where there's other organisms actually involved, and having two species around, like this one here and this one here, will also mean that the natural enemies are going to be interacting with them as well. And so the outcome of this herbivore-herbivore effect might also be shaped by the presence of these natural enemies.